The date is April 23rd, 1990. The Frank Irwin Center in Austin thrums with the energy of thousands of wrestling fans. Saturday night's main event is in full swing, and somewhere in the card comes a moment that will crystallize, in a single brutal image, the trajectory of a man who once seemed destined for greatness. Hillbilly Jim takes his position in the ring, his weathered face and bib overalls catching the arena lights. His entrance music, a folksy barn dance tune that once drew monster reactions from crowds across America. But tonight is different. Tonight, he's not a featured babyface in the Ascendant. He's not the second most popular face in the World Wrestling Federation, the man personally trained by Hulk Hogan himself. The chosen star who seemed poised to carry a company into the next decade. Tonight, he's about to be demolished by Earthquake in a squash match. A glorified jobber role that will culminate in him being carried from the ring on a stretcher. The sitting splash comes. The crowd watches as this once protected talent is obliterated, his body broken and limp. As the stretcher wheels him away, a haunting question hangs over the arena. What happened? How did a man climb so high so fast, only to plummet into near obscurity? How did the rocket push that seemed inevitable just 5 years earlier simply evaporate? And perhaps most damningly, why did Vince McMahon abandon him? The answer to these questions reveals something profound about the nature of professional wrestling itself, about momentum, fear, accident, and the sometimes cruel mathematics of the entertainment business. This is the story of Hillbilly Jim, and it is a tragedy written in the language of professional wrestling, a story not of malice, but of accident, of fear, of lost opportunity, and of a gimmick that became a prison from which there was no escape. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the promise. In late 1984, Vince McMahon was building an empire. He had Hulk Hogan, the largest draw in professional wrestling history. He had the Rock and Wrestling connection, connecting mainstream America to the spectacle of the squared circle. He had Jimmy Snuka, Andre the Giant, and Rowdy Roddy Piper. But what Vince was always hunting for, what he was obsessed with finding, was the next babyface, the next star, the next poster child who could carry the company into the future and ensure its dominance through the remainder of the decade. And then James Morris walked into his arena. Morris appeared initially as Big Jim, a wrestling fan who sat in the front row and eventually decided to try his hand in the business. It was a simple concept, the everyman who could become a wrestler. But Vince saw something deeper. He saw a man with charisma, with natural crowd connection, with the ability to embody a character that Middle America could rally behind. In early 1985, they created the Hillbilly Jim character, a simple-minded Appalachian hillbilly from Mudlick, Kentucky, trained by the greatest wrestler alive, Hulk Hogan himself. It was a stroke of genius. Vince packaged him with a series of vignettes showing Hogan putting boots on his feet. A literal passing of the torch, a benediction from the company's biggest star to his chosen successor. This was a man being positioned, unmistakably and deliberately, for a major push into the upper echelons of the company. The reactions were immediate and undeniable. Hillbilly Jim was massively over. Crowds loved him. They chanted for him. When he appeared on television, they responded with a roar that suggested genuine connection, not just performative enthusiasm. At the War to Settle the Score on February 18, 1985, he won his first high-profile singles match, defeating René Goulet, and the momentum continued to build. The rocket ship was ascending. In those early weeks and months, long-term plans were almost certainly being drawn up. The merchandise opportunities, the action figure line, the appearances on talk shows, the eventual progression through the mid-card and into legitimate main event contention. Hillbilly Jim was not going to be a comedy act. He was not going to be a tag team specialist or a nostalgia figure pulled out for special occasions. He was going to be a star, a main event star, a draw, a pillar upon which the company could build its future. Then came the moment that changed everything. Just days after his War to Settle the Score victory, the moment when his star was still climbing, Morris found himself at a show in San Diego. He was in Hulk Hogan's corner during a match between Hogan and Brutus Beefcake. Johnny V, Beefcake's manager, was being chased around ringside by the eager Hillbilly Jim. It was the kind of thing that happened hundreds of times in professional wrestling. The babyface chasing the heel manager, the crowd reacting with energy, the narrative of the match being played out on every inch of the ringside area. But then, in one of those cruel moments that professional wrestling and life sometimes produces, Morris slipped on a wet spot on the arena floor. His knee gave way. The injury was significant. He was going to be out for months. The trajectory that had been ascending so dramatically was suddenly halted. It was a freak incident, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone in the chaotic environment of a professional wrestling event. But accidents in the wrestling business have consequences that ripple through the entire machine in ways that seem disproportionate to the incident itself. When a star is suddenly unavailable, when momentum must be halted, when the carefully constructed push is interrupted, something shifts in the executive mind. A seed of doubt is planted. Is this man injury-prone? Can we really count on him as a long-term investment? Will he suffer future injuries that will continue to derail plans? The executives begin to protect themselves. They begin to hedge their bets. They become more cautious. While Hillbilly Jim spent those 6 months in recovery, the federation was exploding. The company was growing exponentially. New stars were emerging. The hierarchy was being redrawn almost monthly as the business continued its unprecedented expansion. New talent was being pushed. New feuds were being created. The opportunity cost of Hillbilly Jim's absence was being filled by other babyfaces who were now building their own momentum, their own following, and their own narrative momentum. And when Morris finally returned to in-ring competition, something had fundamentally changed. The trust was fractured. The momentum had evaporated like morning dew. The rocket push was, for all practical purposes, over. But Vince had another idea, and this one would prove to be the final nail in Hillbilly Jim's coffin. To fill in the time during Morris's recovery, they had introduced his family, Uncle Elmer, Cousin Luke, Cousin Junior, cartoonish characters designed to keep the Hillbilly Jim character alive in the minds of the audience without needing Morris to perform. These characters were intentionally exaggerated, comic relief incarnate. But here's where the tragedy deepens. When Morris returned, instead of returning to the serious babyface positioning that had been planned for him before the injury, he found himself locked into this family unit. The comedy aspect that might have been a temporary placeholder had become, in the creative consciousness, the essential nature of the character. Hillbilly Jim wasn't a legitimate babyface being groomed for main event contention anymore. He was a fun character. He was entertainment. He was the man who danced to his theme music with his family members, pulling children from the crowd, making people smile. It was not a role designed for ascension. It was a role designed for mid-card mediocrity, tag team duty, and battles against the monster heels of the era like Big John Studd and King Kong Bundy. His ring ability, which had shown promise in those early vignettes and debut matches, was never truly showcased again. Instead of wrestling main event talent, instead of building meaningful storylines that could elevate him, he was matched against mid-card fixtures and enhancement talent. Instead of meaningful feuds with the company's top stars, he was given novelty appearances. Appearances at WrestleMania as a curiosity, a Battle Royal entry, a tag team member rather than a singles competitor of substance. He wrestled in tuxedo matches. He faced the same opponents year after year. He became a caricature of himself, locked in a gimmick that guaranteed he would never rise again, no matter how hard he worked or how over he remained with certain segments of the audience. By the time April 1990 rolled around, Hillbilly Jim was a man in slow decline. The company had moved on. New stars had emerged and grown beyond him. His window, which had been open so wide in 1985, was now shut. And so when that squash match with Earthquake came down, when the sitting splash flattened him, when the stretcher carried him away, it felt less like a climactic moment and more like a footnote. What happened to Hillbilly Jim is a story that repeats itself throughout professional wrestling history. It is the story of a man with legitimate charisma and drawing power who suffered a single injury at exactly the wrong moment. It is the story of how the wrestling business, always conservative, always protective of its investments, began to doubt him at the precise moment when faith was most needed. It is the story of how a character designed as temporary relief during his recovery became his permanent role, a role that offered no path to ascension, only infinite variations on the same gimmick. It is the story of momentum lost and never regained. He was not abandoned out of malice, he was abandoned out of fear. Fear that he was injury-prone. Fear that the investment would not pay off. And so Vince McMahon made a calculation, a business decision that, in retrospect, probably saved the company money in the short term, but cost professional wrestling a star who might have been. Following that loss to Earthquake, Hillbilly Jim returned to perform in house shows and remained with the company until 1991. But his story really ended on that day in San Diego. Everything that followed was just the slow, inevitable decline of a push that had never recovered its momentum. A star that had burned so brightly for a moment before being extinguished not by failure, but by accident, by fear, and by the wrestling business's tragic inability to trust its own instincts when they are tested by the smallest misfortune.